All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back for section 2, episode 2. So, last week we talked about bony anatomy, lower cervical, upper thoracic, ribs. Today is going to be all about muscles in that same region. Let's go ahead and next week will be about nerves. And then episode 4, as we did in last section, will be about self treatment and exercise. But let's go ahead and jump into the muscles today. We're going to talk about the scalene muscle group first. So, we'll spin around to the side on the model here. There are 3 different muscles that make up the scalene muscle group. So you got the anterior scalene, the middle scalene, and the posterior scalene. Now the first 2, the anterior, the middle, those are going to come down and attach onto our first rib. And then the posterior is going to come down a little bit further onto the second rib. And then they each kind of, you can see how they come up and attach in various places in the cervical spine. So the main takeaway for the scalene muscle group, if this group gets toned up for whatever reason, going to want to elevate those ribs, and issues can arise from that. It's also going to limit lateral flexion, but kind of all movements, rotation, flexion, extension through the cervical spine. And we'll we'll definitely talk more about the scalenes next week when we get into the nerves, because there's definitely some things to consider there for the scalenes. But for today, let's keep on cruising. Next muscle to talk about here is the SCM. The full name of this guy is a mouthful. It's called your sternocleidomastoid. It's named for its points of attachment. So sterno is the sternum, cleido is clavicle, and mastoid, if you remember back to some of the previous episodes, is that bump right behind on our skull, right behind our ears. So sternal head, clavicular head, and they come together and attach onto the mastoid. So SCM, just to keep it simple, right? Now, this is one of the main movers of our head and our neck. Rotation, lateral flexion, and you can see mine kind of pop out there when I do those 2 movements together. Now, conversely, because my SCM on my right side is going to turn me to the left, so it's going to limit my right rotation. So that's what I have trouble with. It's more related to upper cervical issues, but that muscle is going to kind of follow suit. So all this stuff really starts to intertwine. It's all connected, right, guys? The other thing, and this is true everywhere, but the SCM is a really good illustration of this. The SCM is a mover. It's not a stabilizer. And what we tend to do with just looking at our phones and computers, I know I'm a broken record talking about that kind of stuff, but that we force that SCM to become a stabilizer, and that's just not what it's built for. So it's going to get tight. It's going to get trigger points in it. If that goes on long enough, it can start to be painful here or give you headaches, all kinds of different stuff that can happen there. The other thing about bad posture, remember the points of attachment. And if we're chin out, kind of looking down like this, and this happens concurrently with suboccipital tightness, is you're putting that SCM in a shortened position. And if you leave any muscle in a shortened position, you're not regularly using it or stretching it, it's just going to take up the slack. So that over time can make it really hard to get back up into appropriate posture. There's this concept that was developed a long time ago, the Yanda Cross syndrome, and I'll put a little graphic up and you can see the graphic there. All right, next muscle is just so you've got something to impress people at cocktail parties. I'm half kidding. This muscle is called the omohyoid, and it originates from our scapula, and there is an intermediate tendon. So that means it's got its point of attachment on the scapula. Then there's a muscle belly, and then there's a tendon, and then there's another muscle belly before it attaches here on our hyoid bone. You can just think of that as your Adam's apple. So it's a pretty unique muscle right there. And that intermediate tendon actually, it's kind of like a pulley system behind our SCM and some of the cervical fascia. Some of the cervical fascia kind of tacks it down to our collarbone and the first rib. So and again, you can see this in the images there. But it swings forward, pulleys, and then comes up and attaches here. And it's involved in swallowing and reestablishing airway for breathing, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so pretty interesting little muscle there, right? All right, let's keep cruising though. We're going to spin around to the back and look at some of these muscles that lay over the top of the suboccipitals. First one we'll talk about is the semispinalis, and you can see how it's really right over the top of those. So rewind to when we were doing the trigger point release on the suboccipitals with the crossball. Yeah, you're absolutely going to get some pressure on this muscle, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's probably going to help you out. They're going to be, because they're right side by side like that, when one gets toned up, knotted up, whatever, the other probably is too, right? So you can treat those things concurrently. The semispinalis is going to do extension and some lateral flexion of our head and our neck. So then we can look at the splenius as well. A little bit wider, kind of heads towards that mastoid process where the SCM attaches. This guy is going to give us some rotation, but still some extension and side bending as well. Not getting in too deep into these. I just want you guys to know what all is there. Let's talk about a couple muscles that interact with the ribs. So let's spin around here, zoom in a little bit. Or actually, the first one we're going to look at is on the back. It's called the levatores. Pretty cool name. And that you can imagine what that muscle does just by looking at it. That's, with inspiration, it's going to give us some elevation of the ribs. And then the intercostals, you can see kind of in between. So they're going to help pull those ribs down, get some depression, and push air back out. Let's see. Obviously, there's tons more we can talk about in any of these episodes, but I want to keep them relatively short. So we're going to call it good on the muscles for lower cervical thoracic ribs. Stay tuned for next week. We'll get into talking about some neural structures in the region.